of shame or guilt associated with acknowledging the Native American role in America's development.
This land that we're on, where we're sitting now and where these events took place, was land that embraced the dust of our ancestors for 1,000 years. The Oneida people, from what we know of the historical oral legend, have lived here since time immemorial.
They call themselves the people of the Standing Stone. For more than 1,000 years, they had made their home along the swift waters, rolling plains, and game-rich plateaus in the heart of what is now New York State.
The Oneida Indian Nation is one of the 6 nations of the Iroquois, or more properly Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which was the strongest confederacy of indigenous nations in North America.
Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. Many years ago, the 5 nations of the Confederacy were at war with each other to the point it threatened our very existence. So we were told that one day the Creator sent a messenger with a message that we should cease our conflict and join together and have peace with one another.
Forever after, the 5 and later 6 nations of the proud Iroquois Confederacy would convene a common council fire to settle their differences peacefully.
When peace was established, they allowed the nations to retain their sovereignty and their nationhood and their separateness, and yet created a collaboration, a unity. And it caused them to be very strong because of the unity.
To a remarkable degree, the most cherished and deeply held values and beliefs of what would soon become the United States: love of liberty, independence, and the land itself, along with a passionate commitment to pluralism, individuality, strength through unity, and peace, have been anticipated and embodied in beliefs that had bound nations of the Iroquois Confederacy centuries earlier.
The nations were geographically laid out east to west, with the Mohawk being on the eastern door, we would call it. And then the Oneidas, the Onondagas, were centrally located, the Nikiugas, and the Senecas were considered keepers of the western door.
By the middle of the 18th century, the European competition for dominance in North America has really boiled down to a contest between the 2 superpowers of Europe, England and France. The French have built a network of alliances with Indian people based on the fur trade. And the difference between the fur trade and settlement is that the fur trade required the presence of native people because it required Indian customers. Settlement usually requires Indian absence because settlers want Indian land. So at the end of the French and Indian War, when the British finally win, the British colonists will be free to swarm over the Appalachian Mountains. The British government sees that if colonists are allowed unchecked access to Indian land, it will just become an arena of violence and bloodletting. They want Western expansion, but they want it to be ordered and controlled. So they issued what's called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, whereby George III declares that the Appalachian Mountains will be a boundary, essentially, between British settlement and Indian country. For people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Washington, who'd invested in Indian land and had expected to secure the fruits of victory in 1763, this was a huge blow. Almost as soon as the proclamation was issued, landed interest in the colonies started lobbying to get this boundary moved. And at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, Sir William Johnson, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British in the North, meets with several thousand Iroquois people to negotiate the new boundary line right in Oneida country. And so for Indians, the revolution is going to become a war about their land, because if they lose their homeland, they lose their identity as a people. But for the Americans, to win those lands is essential to their identity and their future as a nation.
Initially, the native people viewed this as a fight between brother and brother, the British and the colonists, and really endeavored to stay neutral.
Both the British and the Americans operate on the assumptions that if Indian people are not for you, then they're going to be against you. So Indian communities are subjected to this tremendous pressure from both sides to pull them one way or the other.
Council fire was covered. Each nation was then permitted to take what course of action they thought was in their best interest. And so the Oneida people had to decide, would it be better to stay loyal to the colonists who wanted a better life, freedom from persecution, who thought to live, in a sense, the way the Indians lived, free from that kind of oppression from sovereigns and monarchies and aristocracy, and where everyone was equal.
Most of the Iroquois nations sided with the British because they viewed the American colonists as the people who were eager to seize their lands. The Oneida saw a more effective path in allying with the Americans because they may have seen that the Americans were the future of the occupation of that territory and that they needed to work together with them rather than to resist.
When the Oneidas commit themselves to help the Patriots, that means the Patriots have an armed force in Oneida warriors that are particularly effective in forest warfare, much more effective than any comparable sized group of Patriots.
The war would bring together an extraordinary group of people and join them in unbreakable bonds of friendship and solidarity, including George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and the Marquis de Lafayette, a 20-year-old aristocratic Frenchman destined to play a crucial role in the war, and the three great Oneida leaders, including the sage Good Peter, who would urge his people to support the struggling new United States, and the war chief Shenandoah and Honieri Doxtator. In 1777, as war spread throughout the colonies, the Oneidas took up arms with the embattled Continental Army, supplying intelligence, supplies, and warriors, as upstate New York exploded into civil war, pitting loyalists and patriots, the American and British armies, and Native American groups, one against the other.
In 1777, the British make their most concerted effort to send in substantial armies with the goal to capture Albany and to divide New England off from the rest of the United States.
One of the most decisive moments came in early August, when British forces moved to cut the colonies in two at the Battle of Oriskany.
At Oriskany, you have Mohawks, you also have many Senecas fighting for the British, and they come into combat with the Oneidas. Up to 90 Oneidas with a few Tuscaroras were engaged in that battle. And here the whole tradition for centuries has been, above all else, to stand together, we must not kill one another. And they start killing one another. It's a total bloodbath.
The Oneida ability to assist the Patriots in defending Fort Stanwix is going to be a major contribution to a Patriot effort to stop the most important British invasion of New York State during the war.
6 weeks later, in September and early October 1777, two watershed engagements would take place south of Saratoga, New York, where the Oneida would send 150 men to help beat back a large invasion, led by British General John Burgoyne. Both British offenses failed, stymied by superior American forces and their Oneida allies. and on October 17th, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army to the Americans.
The great victories of Saratoga convinced the French that they should come out and support the Americans openly. Up until that point, it's questionable whether the Americans could have outlasted the British, whether they could have won the war. But with that inestimable French assistance in the form of troops, in the form of subsidies, in the form of food and clothing, muskets, cannons, that really does provide a critical difference.
During the bitter cold winter of 1778, as Washington's ill-fed, ill-clothed Continental Army huddled miserably encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, Washington himself sent a plea to the Oneida, imploring them to send warriors to serve as scouts and guides. Without hesitation, the Oneida sent more than 50 of their people, marching 300 miles to help the beleaguered American forces.
A party of 75 to 100 Oneidas arrived at Valley Forge in May of 1778.
When most people think about war, they think about the combat part. But wars are won or lost on supply lines, on maintaining the troops and their morale. Providing resources was vitally important to the success of the American Revolution. And the support of the Oneidas was vital in maintaining the morale of the American troops at Valley Forge.
By the summer of 1780, much of the Oneida homelands had been devastated by the fighting and by the brutal destruction and burning of villages and farms across the area. For the rest of the war, the Oneida would continue to provide invaluable assistance to the American cause.
In the end, French assistance enables Washington's army to trap a major British army at Yorktown. And it is the surrender of that British force in 1781 at Yorktown that will persuade the British leaders that the war is lost and that they ought to make a peace with the United States.
They played a crucial role in every facet of the war, and they were invited by Washington to come down and send a delegation to Yorktown because General Washington wanted them to be there when it counted, when the war was ending.
The Continental Congress in 1777, and I want to read this, recognized the contribution to the War of Independence by the Oneidas with these words: "We have experienced your love strong as the oak, and your fidelity unchangeable as truth. You have kept fast the ancient covenant chain and preserved it free from rust and decay, and bright as silver. While the sun and moon continue to give light to the world, we shall love and respect you. As our trusty friends, we shall protect you and shall at all times consider your welfare as our own." Those are pretty powerful words. I think that when you say that to someone, and it was said to our people by the Continental Congress, that it means something.
After the war is over, they have to begin to rebuild their lives. They've lost pretty much everything.
The Oneida people, the sacrifices they made, they lost a third of their population in the Revolutionary War. It's 1 out of every third person.
At the second Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784, when other Iroquois people are being divested of the land and being told, you sided with the British lost, you're the defeated allies of a defeated enemy, and by right of conquest. The Oneidas were told, no, your lands will be okay.
In 1794, the Treaty of Canandaigua explicitly reaffirmed the Oneidas' claim to retain their traditional homeland in perpetuity as America's first allies. In practice, however, The federal government seldom enforced this part of the treaty. And in the years to come, New York State
Suffer this at the hands of people whom they put their lives on the line to help. So the future of the American nation is predicated upon translating Native American homelands into American real estate. The tragedy for the Oneida was, in the end, it side of the revolution we fought on. Your experience at the end, in the generation or so after the revolution, had to do with the fact that you were Indian, not to do with the fact that you'd been a patriot because Indians had land which the nation and the states and the citizens wanted.
within 25
that he helped found. And when he visited Oneida Country, upstate New York, he didn't see any Oneida presence.
And one day he finally said, "Where are the Oneidas? Where are my friends?"
For more than 2 centuries following the American Revolution, the Oneida, like Native American tribes across the country, would suffer enormous hardships and struggle heroically to come to terms with what had happened to their people, their homeland, and their culture as treaties were broken, lands torn away, and populations diminished.
The losses of land continue to the point where, as of the early 20th century, there were only 32 acres remaining in Oneida ownership.
I brought with me today this muslin cloth, and it's one of the terms of the Treaty of Canandaigua. To this day, that treaty is considered the oldest treaty recognized as still a valid treaty. Since 1794, every year, someone in Washington, to fulfill an annual term of the treaty, buys muslin cloth for the Oneida people and other members within the 6 nations. So today, this is 1 year's allocation. It's so small because there wasn't an inflationary clause, and there was a certain amount of money allocated. My grandmother always said to go and get it, no matter if it gets to the size of a postage stamp. But it's a very important symbol, because this is one of the provisions of a treaty that the United States made with the United Nations, one of the signatories. Treaties are not made between citizens, they're made with other nations. So it represents the sovereignty of Indian nations. And you wonder, why can we still get a treaty cloth, but our lands are lost?
In 1988, Congress enacted the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which unleashed the possibility of tribal gaming.